Now we're moving ahead to what you might call late Romantic or early 20th century poets, or maybe poet is the wrong word. You'll see what I mean in a minute. And here I think the influence of the painters becomes more prominent. Now, one major figure that maybe you haven't discussed, maybe you haven't heard of, is Walter Pater, who was primarily a scholar or a kind of critic, although he's famous as a prose stylist. And when we think of great writers of English prose, we normally think of novelists or short story writers. But of course, there are many other genres of prose, and criticism is one of those genres. So some people would say that Walter Pater is one of the great English prose stylists. He's relevant to our lecture because he wrote a famous book called The Renaissance, which is his interpretation of the Italian Renaissance and its relevance to poetry. And this is one of the most important texts in late 19th century aestheticism, at least in England. And Pater was a big influence on Oscar Wilde and James Joyce, Ezra Pound, and other major 20th century modernist writers. And this, what you see on the screen, is perhaps Pater's most famous passage, which I will read. She is older than the rocks among which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times and learned the secrets of the grave, and has been a diver in deep seas, and keeps their fallen day about her, and trafficked for strange webs with Eastern merchants. And, as Leda, was the mother of Helen of Troy, and, as St. Anne, the mother of Mary. And all this has been to her but as the sound of lyres and flutes, and lives only in the delicacy with which it has molded the changing lineaments and tinged the eyelids and the hands. So do any of you know who the she is that Pater is describing? Can anyone say? I guess not. So I'll just tell you who it is. It's this one right here, the famous Mona Lisa. Now, to be honest with you, I have no idea how he got from this image to that description. This description seems to be largely Pater's extremely fanciful daydreaming about this image, but Pater's description or kind of reverie about the Leonardo's Mona Lisa was itself extraordinarily influential. One writer who was particularly struck by Pater's description was the Irish poet William Butler Yeats. And Yeats produced he edited a famous collection of modern poetry. And the first poem in that collection is Pater's description of the Mona Lisa. Although Yeats does something very interesting, is that he takes Pater's prose paragraph and he chops it up into verse, creating a free verse poem, which is quite interesting. And you could actually compare this free verse poem to Pater's prose. You could say actually that Pater's prose, which is so stylistically elaborate, is a kind of prose poetry. And Yeats is giving us a kind of free verse translation or adaptation of Pater. It's also, I mean, this is very unusual because Yeats usually didn't write in free verse, and this is a quite strange thing for him to do. You could actually ask yourself, well, which is better? Is this better as the prose paragraph, or is it better as the free verse poem? And you might question, why does Yeats break the lines where he does? But it's very interesting. It's also an example, believe it or not, of what we now call conceptual writing, where you take a pre-existing text and you submit it to some kind of procedural rules or some kind of rewriting algorithm to produce a new text. It's quite one of the most common things in what you might call experimental poetry in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But Yeats is already doing a version of that in the early 20th century, rewriting or retranscribing, perhaps, of Pater's description of the Mona Lisa. And you can see why Yeats would be attracted to this if you know anything about Yeats, because Yeats loved the story of Helen of Troy, which he connected to his own life, and he loved the story of Leda, the mother of Helen, who was, according to Greek mythology, raped by Zeus. Zeus took the form of a swan to do that, and one of Yeats's best-known poems is the sonnet Leda and the Swan. Yeats comments on Pater's description of the Mona Lisa. I recall Pater's description of the Mona Lisa. Had the individual soul of Da Vinci's sitter gone down with the pearl divers, or trafficked for strange webs? Or did Pater foreshadow a poetry, a philosophy where the individual is nothing? So I heard you mention humanism in your discussion, and I wonder if you could also find inhumanism in the Italian Renaissance, or a desire to go beyond the human, which might sound perverse, but that seems to be what Pater and Yeats are trying to get at. The idea of the Mona Lisa as a more than human, a superhuman character, a kind of vampire who is older than the human race, or older than Jesus, a mysterious entity. Or did Pater foreshadow a poetry, a philosophy where the individual is nothing, human experience no longer shut into brief lives, cut off into this place and that place, for time cannot be divided? Somewhere in the middle of it all, Da Vinci's sitter had private reality like that of the dark lady among the women Shakespeare had imagined. So, if you know anything about Shakespeare's sonnets, there's a section of the sonnets which seems to be devoted to a woman. Most of Shakespeare's sonnets are addressed to a man, but some of them are addressed to a woman, and that woman is usually called the Dark Lady because Shakespeare describes her as having dark skin and dark hair. Actually, Shakespeare describes her as a kind of anti-Petrarchan woman. The typical Petrarchan woman is a completely idealized, angelic, super pale, golden-haired, angel type figure, whereas Shakespeare gives us a much more plausible, normal human, frankly. And actually, the Mona Lisa is also a kind of maybe not anti, but a non-Petrarchan image. She doesn't quite match the stereotype image of a female beauty that you get from the Petrarchan poems. Not just those written by Petrarch, but those of his imitators, especially those of his imitators. Somewhere in the middle of it all, Da Vinci's sitter had private reality like that of the Dark Lady among the women Shakespeare had imagined. But because that private soul is always behind our knowledge, though always hidden, it must be the sole source of pain, stupefaction, evil. A musician, he imagines heaven as a musical composition, a mathematician as a relation of curves, a poet as a dark, inhuman sea. So the idea that somehow Da Vinci's Mona Lisa is an emblem of this dark and human force seems to me quite strange. I don't get it. Looking at the image, I don't see that, but Pater saw that, and Yeats apparently was highly persuaded by Pater's imagination. And this impacts Yeats's own poetry, including one of his best-known poems, Among School Children. In this poem, which is based on a real-life incident, Yeats had some kind of government position at one point when he was somewhat old, and he had to inspect a elementary school. So one day he shows up at school and he's inspecting the classroom and he's looking at young female students. And he's thinking, as he often does in his poems, of the woman he loved, Maud Gonne, the woman he loved and who usually rejected his love. But he wrote many poems about her. Some of those poems represent her as Helen of Troy, but he has other mythological ways of thinking about her. And here he sees the young girl students or young woman students, and he imagines his own beloved Maud Gonne as she might have looked like when she was a young Irish student. And thinking of that fit of grief or rage, I look upon one child a tover there, and wonder if she, Maud Gonne, stood so at that age. For even daughters of the swan can share something of every paddler's heritage. That's probably an allusion to Leda and the Swan, which is also relevant to Pater's description of the Mona Lisa, which mentions Leda. And had that color upon cheek or hair, and thereupon my heart is driven wild. She stands before me as a living child. So he has this ecstatic vision of his, in real life, he could never see his beloved Maud Gonne as a child. He could only see her as an adult woman, but now he imagines that he's almost going back in time to see what his beloved would look like if she were a young child. But then her present image floats into the mind, the image of Maud Gonne now, at the time of the poem, the time of the poem's composition, or the time of this classroom inspection scene. And so at this point, Maud Gonne would be a middle-aged woman and who has lost the stunning beauty of her youth. Her present image floats into the mind. The Quattrocento finger fashionate, hollow of cheek, as though it drank the wind and took a mess of shadows for its meat. A Quattrocento probably refers to the Italian Renaissance, namely the 15th century, the 1400s, the time of many of the most important Italian painters of the Italian Renaissance. And he might also be particularly thinking of Leonardo da Vinci and the Mona Lisa, although the Mona Lisa, I think, is usually dated to early 1500s, like 1502, something like that. So technically, maybe it's not Quattrocento, but Da Vinci would have been a Quattrocento person born in the 1400s. Now, I don't really see that. I mean, he seems to be imagining Maud Gonne as a very emaciated, thin woman, as though she's been not eating anything. She has a hollow cheek, as though she doesn't drink wine or water. She just drinks the wind and eats shadows instead of meat. And when I look at the Mona Lisa, I don't really see that. But maybe Yeats wasn't thinking of this image. He was thinking of Pater's description of the image as though it were a vampire. It's a kind of dark, undead, humanoid creature. And then with a tinge of misogyny, Yeats imagines his beloved Maud Gonne, with whom he had many fierce political arguments, as this kind of Quattrocento painting or image from such a painting.